So metabolism can be a really confusing topic for students, in large part because there are so many details. And if we just start with the details, what we often end up doing is being lost in this maze. You're like, oh, I've got glycolysis over here, and I've got the pentose phosphate over here. How are they related? And so it's just sort of wandering around through these things trying to make the connections up front. The goal of today's video is to start with a high-level view. Instead of worrying about the details of individual pathways, we're going to talk about these are a set of pathways, how they're related, so that over the next set of videos, I can say, this is what glycolysis is, this is what the pentose phosphate pathway is, and you'll have some understanding for how it links into the rest of metabolic networks. This is going to be the picture that we're filling in. It's a very high-level schematicized view of central carbon metabolism. We're going to highlight bits as we go here, but I'm going to highlight two things when we start. We've got glycolysis. This is glucose up here. Our friend, the 6-carbon sugar. This is pyruvate down here. And what we're going to be talking about are ways that things sort of pass back and forth between all of these different metabolic systems. The analogy I think that's helpful in thinking about this is actually that of a transit system. So this is a map of the TriMet rail system, which is for Portland. There are some features of transit systems that directly map onto metabolism that make it a useful analogy. The three that I want to highlight are that there are individual stops, right? So different stops. You can't just jump off of a light rail anywhere. It has to hit a particular station where you get on and off. That's the equivalent to metabolites, right? You can't just form anything, right? You've got glucose, you've got glucose 6-phosphate, you've got fructose 6-phosphate, etc. There are discrete places that metabolism goes. There are multiple lines in this system, right? So if you just look at a picture of any transit map in the world, basically there's like the red line and the green line and the blue line. We see the same thing in metabolism. We name them, so it's glycolysis and gluconeogenesis and the pentose phosphate pathway. But those are the equivalent of lines within a metro system or transit system. And finally, in systems like this, there are almost always different networks that are connected, but only loosely. So for example, in Portland, you can take the light rail, you can take the light rail around, and you can get off of the light rail and then get onto the streetcar, but they're not directly connected to each other, right? The light rail and the streetcar are different networks that touch, but you can't, take a light rail train onto the street. And we see exactly the same thing in metabolism. So for example, the glucose network, which we're going to talk about today, is connected to the acetyl-CoA network, but it's a loose connection. And so what we're going to see is, that's basically like hopping from the light rail, onto the streetcar, for example, because there are different networks that are part of the same transit system. Okay, so our goal today is to take this map, this high-level map of metabolism, and we're going to talk about a collection of transit lines through it. I've even color-coded them like transit lines. And this is, we're starting into glucose metabolism over the next set of videos. So we're actually going to focus on only part of this, which is this part over here, which is the glucose part of the network, which has individual stops, glucose 6-phosphate, etc. Multiple lines, so the different colors in here. And then multiple networks. We have our glucose network that I've circled, and then this block over here, which we're going to talk about later, is the acetyl-CoA network. Okay, so let's just start digging into these. What we're going to talk about with each of these is basically where do they go, right? If you take a transit system and you get onto a train, it's almost always says, what's the terminus? Where's that train going to go? We're going to be doing the same sort of thing here. Where does it start? Where does it end? Okay, so the purple line. The purple line is known as glycolysis. And what glycolysis does is cells use it to generate energy. So they're going to take glucose and they're going to turn it into pyruvate. They're going to extract some energy along the way. Most metabolic pathways have a reverse of some sort. And so it turns out there's a reverse here. And this is going to be our orange line. So we've got glycolysis, goes from glucose to pyruvate, uses it to make energy. The reverse of this, we're going from pyruvate to glucose, it's making glucose. It's known as gluconeogenesis. So we're basically going to start at pyruvate, go to glucose, and we're going to use it to make glucose. So we can generate energy by glycolysis. We can make glucose with gluconeogenesis. What else can we do? Well, it turns out a big central region inside of this metabolic network is actually right here. This molecule, glucose 6-phosphate, is kind of like the Union Station, right? It seems like every town has a Union Station, right? The central station that's in the middle of that town, which connects lots of things. So what you can do from glucose 6-phosphate is not only go on to glycolysis or gluconeogenesis, you can also hop over here. And these are, I've just drawn both lines at once, the green line and the pink line. What do the green line and the pink line do? Well, they're known as glycogenesis. Sorry, these are words I actually cannot say. In classes, I get mocked by my students. Mocked. But it's glycogenolysis. Nope, I still can't say it. Glycogenolysis. So that's lysing glycogen and glycogen. Can't do it. Glycogenesis. Making glycogen, right? So we can make glucose out of glycogen, so we can pull things out of storage, glucose out of storage, or we can store glucose for later. So this is storing energy, releasing energy, all from this sort of side shunt over here on the side. So that is what's going on here. So this is storing energy as glycogen, retrieving energy as glycogen. Okay. Remember I said that our molecule glucose 6-phosphate is a central player. It's our sort of Union Station. It can also go on to do this thing over here. This thing is known as the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, or PPP. What happens in the oxidative PPP? Well, what we're going to do is make reducing power. So we're going to make molecules of NADPH, which cells are going to use to build other molecules. So if we're making a list of all the things a cell would have to be able to do, it's going to have to be able to extract energy from its environment. Basically, all this stuff is loosely related to making energy. This is it would have to be able to make reducing power so it can build other molecules. Okay, so we have now talked about glycolysis, making energy, gluconeogenesis, which is making glucose. We've talked about storing energy as glycogen and extracting energy as glucose from glycogen. And we've talked about the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, which gives us reducing power. What other lines are available? Well, this is my favorite line, and it's not even really a line. It's more of a mess. But this is the non-oxidative pentose phosphate pathway. And what happens in the non-oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, hopefully you can see, is stuff gets passed around. This is more of a network than a pathway. But what this is used for is it's used to make anabolic starting materials. So things that enter the non-oxidative pentose phosphate pathway get passed around wildly. As they get passed around, some of those can be spun off to make other things. So for example, members of the non-oxidative pentose phosphate pathway go on to be made into amino acids or nucleic acids or other sugars. So it's a starting point for many other sorts of processes. So this stuff was all involved in making energy. This is involved in making reducing power. This is used in getting things ready to go do starting materials. All right, so we've just 2 more stops, actually, then we're going to be done. The next one is fermentation, which is down here. What this is doing is it's taking pyruvate and turning it into lactate. And what is doing pyruvate going to lactate do? It's actually making oxidizing power. It's making NAD+. So this, in a sense, is the opposite. These sort of pair opposite with each other. But this is something that a cell is going to need. It's going to be able to make energy. It's going to need reducing power. It's going to need the ability to make starting materials, and it's going to need oxidizing power. And with those set of things, it's actually really well positioned to go on and live the life of a cell. So we've covered a huge chunk of what a cell needs to do just with this relatively simple in quotes, transit network. All right, I'm going to talk about one other thing and then we're going to be done, and that is this acetyl-CoA connector. And that goes from pyruvate down here into the mitochondrion, where eventually it gets made into this molecule, which is known as acetyl-CoA. Now, remember I said this is like a transit network and that there are different sorts of connectivity that happen. And this connectivity is basically the equivalent of going from the light rail out here, so light rail, to the streetcar over here. So there's a loose connection between the two. There is a connection. You can hop between the two, but once you make the move, you're actually in a completely different set of metabolic networks. But this connection is a really important one because it's what takes us from that one network to the other. And why do cells do that? They primarily use it to generate energy by going from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA and into this network. So this is going to release a ton of ATP eventually. It also, incidentally, gives you oxidizing power. So both of these come out of this gray connector network here. So again, energy generation, that's the first half of the network. We're going to hit that with a whole variety of videos. Oxidative pentose phosphate pathway gives us reducing power. Non-oxidative gives us anabolic starting materials. Fermentation gives us oxidizing power. That is sort of the opposite pairing of reducing power. And then finally, going to the acetyl-CoA network is on our way to generating a ton of energy. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a framework as we start moving forward. We're going to start talking about glycolysis. So it's where it's a good place to start these sorts of reactions. But remember, glycolysis is just one part of this network that's connected to others. And I'm going to highlight as we go how these connections happen, even while we dig in now to the guts and details of this is what glycolysis is, this is what the reactions are, that sort of thing. So thanks for watching, and have a nice afternoon, morning, evening, whatever time of day it is.